Now that we've learned about the functional and structural distinctions between arteries and veins, it's time to take a holistic look at the role of each of the three different types of blood vessels and how they work within the circulatory system as a whole. When we discuss the human circulatory system, which is functionally identical to that of most other major mammal groups, there are two adjectives that we can apply. The first of which is we say that our circulatory system is closed, meaning that the oxygenated blood that transports oxygen to the tissues of our body in order to perform cellular respiration, and the deoxygenated blood, which ultimately needs to be transported back to the lungs in order to get reoxygenated. These two types of blood never ever mix within adult humans, but in organisms that actually have open circulatory systems, such as insects, this is actually possible, and consequently their circulatory systems look nearly unrecognizable compared to that of mammals. The second adjective that we can use is we say that the human circulatory system is a double circulatory system, meaning that it has two halves that ultimately have two different functions represented by the two halves of the heart. So we're going to start the same way that we learned about the heart in this unit by looking at the right side of the heart, because its function is ultimately tied to that of the lungs. And if we know the adjective that represents lungs is the adjective pulmonary, we can come up with the word for the right half of the heart and the connection to the lungs as what we call pulmonary circulation as the first half. And if we follow the deoxygenated blood, therefore carrying carbon dioxide, to each of the lungs, we can see that the goal of the pulmonary capillaries, which are the capillaries that we find on the outside of the alveoli inside of the lungs, we can see that the role of the pulmonary capillaries is the exchange of carbon dioxide from deoxygenated blood. This is how we transfer carbon dioxide into the lungs so that it can be exhaled, and this carbon dioxide is going to be replaced with oxygen gas that has been inhaled that reoxygenates the blood, which then allows it to be transported back to the left side of the heart where it enters the second half of circulation. So if we look at the arteries and veins within the pulmonary half, specifically if we look at the pulmonary artery, we can see that because the pulmonary artery transports blood to the lungs to get reoxygenated, it is unusual for arteries because it is the only artery in adult humans that transports deoxygenated blood, while the pulmonary vein, carrying blood back to the left side of the heart, actually carries oxygenated blood. Now, if we compare this difference, the pulmonary artery transporting deoxygenated blood and the pulmonary vein transporting oxygenated blood, we can compare that to the second half of the circulatory system, exemplified by the left side of the heart. So if we follow the blood from the pulmonary veins as it enters the right atrium and drains down, left atrium, and drains down into the left ventricle to be pumped out the aorta, then this blood from the aorta is going to be transported to all of the other locations within the body that require oxygen for cellular respiration. And this is what we call systemic circulation, because the job of systemic circulation is to transport blood to and from the whole body, or rather the rest of the body, except for the lungs, for the purpose of reoxygenation. So again, the entire purpose of systemic circulation is to transport oxygen to the body so that all of the cells that require energy can use that oxygen in order to perform cellular respiration. So if we go to systemic capillaries, it's easiest to look at the gas exchange that occurs in a specific location. So let's look at the gas exchange that happens in the legs here, although technically this applies to all of the internal organs and all of the parts above the legs as well, like the head and the arms. This is true for all systemic locations. So systemic capillaries are the capillaries that receive oxygenated blood from arteries, and where that oxygen is transported out of systemic capillaries from blood into the cells so that these cells can perform cellular respiration. Now, once the oxygen is released from blood, hemoglobin is going to pick up carbon dioxide that is produced as a waste product from cellular respiration so that the systemic veins can carry this carbon dioxide back to the right ventricle, or rather the right atrium, which then drops it into the right ventricle and pumps it to the lungs so that it can be reoxygenated in pulmonary circulation. So if we look at the difference between the pulmonary circulation and systemic circulation, we can see that systemic arteries, if we look at any artery that is carrying blood away from the left side of the heart, we can see that this is oxygenated blood. And if we look at systemic veins that carry blood back to the right atrium here, we can see that all systemic veins are carrying carbon dioxide, which is the exact opposite of the oxygenated and deoxygenated trend that we see in pulmonary circulation. Now, to contrast the human circulatory system, which has separate circuits for pulmonary and systemic circulation, if we take a look at fish, for example, we recognize that most fish are significantly smaller than humans and therefore do not actually require a double circulatory system, because a heart that only has one atrium and one ventricle like this is actually sufficient to transport blood through the entire fish's body. So this is what we call a single circulatory system, and we can see here that it doesn't actually have separate circuits for pulmonary and systemic functions. We can see that the entire circulatory system of this fish here is a single circulatory system that actually includes both the respiratory capillaries, although we'll talk about how these are different in fish, and the systemic capillaries that provide oxygen to the rest of the fish's body. So here, the only difference in the fish circulatory system in terms of the respiratory part is the fact that fish have gills rather than lungs. But functionally, the gills remain identical. We can see that this would be the pulmonary artery of the fish, and this is definitely considered an artery because it is transporting deoxygenated blood away from the heart. But calling it the pulmonary artery is a little bit misleading because once again it's all on the same circuit here, but we can see functionally the gills are the location where fish get rid of carbon dioxide that they produce from cellular respiration, while the gills absorb oxygen that is dissolved in water, and then the veins here exclusively transport oxygenated blood to the rest of the fish's tissue so that oxygen can then be used to oxygenate all of the cells in the fish's body in order to produce energy using cellular respiration. And the systemic circulatory system, or the systemic vein that we see here, brings the deoxygenated blood back to the heart. And generally, because a fish is much smaller than a human, it doesn't actually require a double circulatory system, because one atrium and one ventricle are strong enough in order to pump blood throughout the entire fish's body, whereas larger organisms such as humans require separate pulmonary and systemic halves. In the final video in this series, we are going to take a detailed look at the structure of the lymphatic system, which is a parallel circulatory system that mainly exists to transport white blood cells, as well as nutrients such as fats that don't dissolve very well in blood.